The morning I found out I was pregnant, I was standing in the cereal aisle at a grocery store, holding a box of oat clusters in one hand and a positive pregnancy test in the other, because I'd taken it in the store bathroom like the absolute disaster I was, and a woman with a toddler on her hip walked past me and smiled. The kind of smiles strangers give when they think you're having a good day. I smiled back. I put the oat clusters in my basket. I walked to the checkout. I paid. I drove home. And then I sat in my car in the driveway of the small house I rented on the eastern edge of town with the test still in my coat pocket and the groceries in the back seat. And I let myself feel it. The particular flavor of terror that comes not from not knowing what to do, but from knowing exactly what you want and being absolutely certain you have no right to want it. My name is Ray Sloan. I'm 28 years old. I'm an Omega. I run the books for a mid-sized landscaping company called Greenfield & Sons, which is neither green nor a field, but is run by a very kind woman named Patricia, who gave me the job 3 years ago when I showed up to her office in the rain with a folder of my work samples and the desperate, quiet energy of someone who had nowhere else to go. I'm good at numbers. I'm good at being quiet. I'm good at making sure everything balances, that every figure lands in the right column, that nothing is unaccounted for. I am not good at accounting for this. The test was faint at first, then it wasn't. I'd bought 3 more at the pharmacy 2 days later, just to be sure, and all 3 came back positive with the same relentless certainty. I was 8 weeks along when I finally made myself call the clinic. The receptionist was kind. The appointment was 2 weeks out. The price of the ultrasound, the first proper one, the confirmation scan, landed in my inbox as a number that made me open my banking app and stare at my savings account for a very long time. I had $212 saved. The ultrasound cost $340. The insurance I had through Greenfield & Sons was good for a lot of things. It was not good for Omega Reproductive Care because the plan was old and the broker who'd set it up 40 years ago had apparently never considered that Omegas might have needs of their own. And Patricia had been meaning to switch providers for 2 years now, but hadn't gotten around to it. So, $340. I sat with that number for a week. I looked at my budget. I rearranged my budget. I cut everything I could think of. The streaming service I barely used, the gym membership I'd forgotten I had, the standing order I'd set up months ago for a magazine I'd never once read. None of it was enough. And then I looked at the watch. My grandfather had given it to me. It was a good watch, not flashy, not the kind of thing you'd wear to impress anyone, but solid and silver and real, with a small engraving on the back that read, "Keep good time." I'd worn it every day for 6 years. It had been on my wrist the morning I'd interviewed at Greenfield & Sons. It had been on my wrist the night of my last heat cycle 14 weeks ago. The night I'd spent with Jeffrey Rollins. I took the watch off. I set it on my kitchen table. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put it in my coat pocket, next to the positive test I still hadn't thrown away, and I drove to the pawn shop on Mercer Street. The man behind the counter at Mercer Pawn was named Dale. He had a beard, like a biblical figure, and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and he handled the watch with a kind of practiced reverence that I appreciated more than I could say in the moment. "Good piece," he said. "Swiss movement? I think so. My grandfather bought it in the 80s. Dale turned it over, read the engraving, set it back down. He looked at me over the glasses. He seemed like the kind of man who had learned, through long years at this particular counter, not to ask the questions that were written plainest on people's faces. "I can do 380, he said. "I only need 350. "I know. I'm giving you 380. I didn't cry. I came close, but I didn't. I took the $380 and I drove to the clinic and I paid for the ultrasound 2 weeks in advance. And I sat in my car afterward with $40 left in my hand and I thought, okay, one thing at a time, one thing at a time. Here is what I have not told you yet. The part that sits at the center of all of this like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples of which have been moving outward for 14 weeks. Jeffrey Rollins is my boss's son. Not Patricia's son. Patricia runs the company, but it was her husband Gerald who built it, and Gerald has a son from his first marriage. a son who is 32 years old, and an alpha, and who manages the field crews and the client accounts, and who walked into the Greenfield and Sons main office 11 months ago after 5 years working in another city, and who has been making my workdays complicated ever since. Not complicated in a bad way exactly, just complicated in the way that things become complicated when someone sits on the edge of your desk to ask you a question, instead of standing 2 feet away like a normal person. And when that someone smells the way Jeffrey Rollins smells, cedar and something warmer, something I have never been able to name, and when that someone over the course of 11 months becomes the person whose laugh you listen for across the office, and whose schedule you've inadvertently memorized, and whose opinion you have started shamefully to care about. I am a private person. I have always been a private person. My heats have always been managed. Suppressants, careful planning, a studio apartment with a good lock. And in 8 years of working life, I have never once had what you could call a workplace entanglement. I was proud of this. I considered it a point of professional integrity. And then there was the Morrison account. The Morrison account was a nightmare. A large residential client whose landscaping budget was complex enough that it required both Jeffrey's client knowledge and my financial oversight to untangle. And we had spent 3 weeks in late autumn going over figures together, sometimes in the conference room, sometimes at the small table by the window in my office. And by the end of it, I knew his handwriting and the way he held a pen and the particular sound he made when he found the error he'd been looking for. A low, satisfied hum that I should not have memorized but had. It was during the Morrison account that I realized I was in trouble. It was after the Morrison account. 2 weeks after, when the suppressants I'd been on for 3 years started failing in the way that suppressants sometimes do. In the way that your body eventually reasserts itself against your careful management of it, that trouble became something more immediate. I want to be clear about what happened. We were both adults. He was not my direct supervisor, Patricia was, and Gerald above her. And we had not, at any point prior to that night, been anything other than professional. What happened was not planned by either of us. It was not careless exactly, but it was not planned, and the morning after. We had sat in my kitchen with coffee and the particular silence of 2 people who had just discovered something about themselves that they weren't sure what to do with, and Jeffrey had said quietly that he thought we should talk about it, and I had said just as quietly that I agreed, and then nothing had happened because we were both apparently very good at agreeing to things and then not doing them. That was 14 weeks ago. We had not talked about it. We had gone back to being professional and careful and the kind of pleasant that is stretched thin over something else, and I had started to believe, to let myself believe, that it had been a one-time thing, a heat event, something that could be filed neatly in a closed folder. And now I was 8 weeks pregnant, and the folder was very much open, and I had no idea what to do with any of it. I paid for the ultrasound on a Wednesday. The appointment was on a Friday morning, 2 weeks out. On the Thursday before the appointment, I came into work early, as I usually did, and I made coffee, and I sat at my desk and opened the Morrison account follow-up I'd been meaning to finish, and everything was normal. Everything was exactly normal. Jeffrey came in at 8:15. I heard the door. I heard his boots on the floor. I did not look up. "Morning," he said, from the direction of the hallway. "Morning," I said, to my screen. This was us lately. This was the shape of things between us. These small, careful exchanges that were technically conversation and technically fine and were slowly, quietly making me miserable in a way I couldn't afford to examine. He went to his office. I stayed at my desk. The morning moved forward. I don't know when he found it. I'd been wearing my coat when I arrived. It was cold, early November by then, and I'd hung it on the hook by the door of my office, which was its usual place. The coat with the pawn shop receipt in the pocket. I'd forgotten the receipt was there. I'd been trying to forget a lot of things. The first I knew of it was when it was already afternoon, already past 3, and Jeffrey appeared in my doorway. He looked, I don't have a better word for it, careful. He looked the way a person looks when they have picked up something fragile and are not sure how to set it down. Ray. I looked up from my screen. Yeah. He held out the receipt. Folded, small, from Mercer Pawn on Mercer Street, dated 2 Wednesdays ago, for one silver wristwatch, Swiss movement, sold for $380. I stared at it. It fell out of your coat pocket, he said, when I grabbed it to hang it up properly. The hook was coming loose. I fixed the hook. Sorry, I should have told you. The receipt fell on the floor. He was explaining himself because he thought I would think he'd been going through my things. He was being careful because he knew the receipt meant something, but he didn't know what. He was standing in my doorway looking at me with those gray eyes and that carefully composed expression, and I thought, very clearly, I am not ready for this. But I also thought, I am so tired. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes from carrying something alone for weeks on end. Not physical tiredness. Or not only that, though the first trimester had been doing interesting and awful things to my body, but the tiredness of holding something heavy and having no one to put it down with. Of being a private person in a situation that was, by definition, no longer private. I had been carrying this for 8 weeks. I had told no one. Not Patricia, not the 2 friends I had in the city, not my mother, not anyone. I had gone to the pharmacy alone, and the grocery store alone, and the clinic alone, and I had sat in my car and breathed and told myself one thing at a time, until the phrase started to feel less like strategy and more like a rosary. Jeffrey was still in the doorway, still holding the receipt. Sit down, I said. Close the door. I told him about the watch first, because that felt safer. The practical part, the part with numbers and decisions in it, the part I could explain without my voice doing anything strange. I told him I'd sold it to pay for something medical. I told him the insurance hadn't covered it. I told him it had been necessary. He listened. He sat in the chair on the other side of my desk, the one clients usually sat in, and he held the receipt in both hands, and he listened without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I expected to. What was the medical thing? He asked when I stopped talking. Jeffrey, Ray. Ray? His voice was quiet, not pushing, just present, like he was making it clear that he wasn't going anywhere, that the door was closed and the afternoon was long and he would wait. What was it? I looked at my hands on the desk. I thought about the 3 pregnancy tests lined up on my bathroom sink. I thought about the clinic receptionist who had been kind. I thought about the ultrasound appointment 48 hours away that I was going to go to alone and sit in the waiting room alone and lie on the table alone and hear whatever there was to hear, alone. I'm pregnant, I said. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it, not empty but full, the way silence gets when it's absorbing something large. Okay, Jeffrey said, just that. Okay. Not as dismissal. I could hear that. As something else. As a person setting their feet, finding the ground under them, making room. The ultrasound is tomorrow morning, I said. The insurance didn't cover it. I needed $340. I had the watch. He nodded slowly. His eyes hadn't left my face. You've been dealing with this for 8 weeks. 8 weeks. He said it like he was placing it on a shelf somewhere, making sure it was real. Alone. Yes, because, he stopped, started again. Ray. You know that I know, I said. I know. I just didn't. I wasn't ready. I'm not sure I'm ready now, but the appointment is tomorrow and I had to tell someone, and you found the receipt, so... I stopped. The tiredness was pressing up against the inside of my chest. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm usually better at knowing what I'm doing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at me with the kind of directness that had always made me slightly off balance, the way he had of making you feel like you were the only thing in his field of vision. What time is the appointment? He said. 9 o'clock. I'll drive you. Jeffrey. I'll drive you, he said again, not forcefully, just simply. Like it was already decided, had already been decided the moment I said I'm pregnant. Like the only question had been the logistics. You sold your grandfather's watch for this. You've been carrying this for 8 weeks without telling anyone. You're not going to the appointment alone. I looked at him. I wanted to argue. I am, as I've said, a private person, and my first instinct when someone offers to help is always a small internal recoil. The reflex of someone who learned young that needing things from people is a risk, that it leaves you open. But underneath that reflex, underneath all of it, was something else. Something that had been growing quietly alongside the other thing, the terrifying new thing, for 8 weeks. I don't know what this means, I said. For us. I haven't figured out what I want or what I'm going to do or... You don't have to have figured that out yet, he said. You just have to be at the clinic at 9 tomorrow. That's all. The rest of it? He paused. The rest of it we can do one thing at a time. I stared at him. He had used my phrase. He hadn't heard me use it. I'd only ever said it to myself, in my car, in those quiet moments of deliberate breathing. But somehow he had arrived at exactly the same words. Okay, I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Okay, he said back. He handed me the receipt. I folded it and put it in my desk drawer. And we sat there for a moment, in the closed office, in the winter afternoon light, with the weight of it between us, not crushing exactly, but real. Present. Something that had stopped being a secret and started being, very tentatively, a shared thing. He picked me up at 8:30. I'd spent the evening before in a state of low-level anxiety that expressed itself as reorganizing my kitchen cabinets, which is something I do when I need to feel like I have control over at least one system in my life. By 11 o'clock, the cabinets were alphabetized, and I had thrown away 6 expired things, and I still hadn't slept. So I lay in my bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about what the ultrasound might show, and what the doctor might say and what I was going to do after, and all the while underneath those thoughts was the smaller, quieter thought of Jeffrey Rollins sitting in the chair across from my desk, saying, "I'll drive you," in that simple, settled way. He arrived exactly at 8:30 in a dark blue truck that I had seen in the Greenfield & Sons parking lot for 11 months and had never been inside. It was clean but lived in, a thermos in the cup holder, a folded map in the door pocket even though everyone used their phones now, a faint smell of cedar and coffee. He handed me a paper cup from the Good Coffee place on 5th Street. I didn't usually take things from people. I took the coffee. We didn't talk much on the drive over. The radio was on, something quiet, instrumental, and the city moved past the windows, and I held the coffee with both hands and watched the streets. It was cold. The trees along Mercer were bare now, their branches making complicated patterns against the gray November sky. "Did you sleep?" he asked, at a red light. "Some." He nodded. He didn't pursue it. The clinic was on the north side of town, a low brick building with frosted glass and a small parking lot. Jeffrey pulled in and cut the engine, and we sat for a second. "Ready?" he said. "No." "Me neither." He said it straightforwardly, like this was just useful information to share. "Let's go anyway." The waiting room was warm and quiet. A couple sat across from us. A woman and her partner, both of them leaning toward each other with that particular gravity of people in the middle of something important. A man sat alone near the window, scrolling his phone. Soft music played from somewhere. Jeffrey sat next to me, not crowding, just present, his shoulder an inch from mine. When I filled out the intake form with slightly unsteady hands, he didn't comment on the unsteadiness. They called my name 20 minutes later. I stood. And then, without planning to, without deciding to, I looked at Jeffrey. "You can come in," I said, "if you want." He was already standing. The ultrasound room was small and dim, the kind of dim that medical spaces get when they're trying to feel less clinical. The technician was a woman named Becca who had a professional warmth that I appreciated, the kind that made you feel seen without making you feel examined. I lay on the table. Jeffrey stood to the side, not in the way, close enough that I could see him in my peripheral vision. When the screen came on, I wasn't prepared. I knew it was going to be small. I'd read enough in those careful late-night reading sessions to know that 8 weeks is early, that what you see is barely a centimeter, that it looks more like a shape than a person. I knew all of that. What I wasn't prepared for was the heartbeat. Becca pointed it out. A small, rapid flutter on the screen, steady and insistent, doing its work with the absolute commitment of something that doesn't know yet how uncertain everything around it is. I heard Jeffrey make a sound. Very quiet. Just a breath, like something had landed in his chest. Strong heartbeat, Becca said. 10 weeks, 4 days, roughly. Everything looks good. 10 weeks, not 8. I'd miscounted. 10 weeks and 4 days. And it had a heartbeat. And it was the size of a strawberry, apparently, which was information I had read and somehow not fully absorbed until now. I looked at the screen for a long time. Becca gave us a moment, fussing with paperwork, and in that moment, Jeffrey reached over and touched the back of my hand. Not grabbing it, just his fingers on the back of my hand, brief and quiet, the way you'd touch something you were trying to make sure was real. I turned my hand over. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just stayed like that for a moment, in the dim room, with the sound of the heartbeat still in the air between us. Afterward, in the parking lot in the cold, we stood by the truck, and I held the printout Becca had given me, a grainy black and white image, the shape on the screen made permanent, and I thought, I am going to be someone's parent. I am going to be someone's parent, and I do not know how to do that, and I am terrified, and I also, inconveniently, want this more than I have wanted almost anything. Ray. Jeffrey's voice was low. He was watching my face. I'm okay, I said, preemptively. I know you're okay, he said. That's not what I was going to say. What were you going to say? He took a breath, not hesitating, collecting. There's a difference, and I had learned to read the difference in 11 months of watching him. I was going to say that I've spent 14 weeks trying to figure out how to bring up the conversation we said we were going to have, he said, and doing a bad job of it. And you've been carrying all of this, and I didn't know, and I should have been better at. He stopped. Tried again. I'm not going to be someone who isn't here for this. I need you to know that. Whatever you decide about everything, about what you want, about us, I'm not going to be someone who disappears. I looked at him. The cold was making his breath visible, small clouds of it in the November air. What do you want? I asked. Because I thought he deserved to be asked too. Not what you're going to do. What do you want? He was quiet for a long moment. I want what was happening before I knew how to call it anything, he said. Those 3 weeks working on the Morrison account. The coffee. The way you hum when you find an error in the spreadsheet. I blinked. I do not hum. You absolutely hum. The corner of his mouth moved. It's a very small hum. You probably don't know you're doing it. I don't hum. Ray. He looked at me steadily. I want this, whatever shape it takes. I want, he gestured, slightly helplessly, between us and the printout in my hands. All of it, if you'll let me. The parking lot was very quiet. Somewhere a car horn sounded, distant from another street. I thought about the 8 weeks I'd spent alone with this. I thought about the watch, and the 3 tests on my bathroom sink, and the cereal aisle, and sitting in my car saying one thing at a time to no one. I thought about the heartbeat. I'll let you, I said. And then, because I was who I was and it felt important to be honest about what that meant, I'm not easy. I don't ask for help well. I reorganize things when I'm anxious, and I go quiet when I'm scared, and I kept this from you for 8-10 weeks, which probably tells you something about my track record with letting people in. I reorganize things when I'm anxious too, he said. My truck's filing system is extremely organized. I looked at the folded map in the door pocket visible through the window. Okay, I said. Okay. He opened the passenger door for me. Not performatively, just as a natural thing, a habitual thing, and I thought about how many small gestures like that I'd noticed and filed away over 11 months without letting myself know why. I got in. He closed the door. He walked around to the driver's side and got in and put the key in and didn't start the engine yet. Are you hungry? He said. Incredibly, I said. Which was true. The first trimester had given me a complicated relationship with food, but this morning, for the first time in weeks, I was simply and straightforwardly hungry. There's a diner 2 blocks east, he said. They do eggs 12 different ways. I want 3 of them, I said. He started the engine. We went to the diner. We ordered eggs and coffee, decaf for me, real for him. And we sat in a booth by the window, and for the first time in 10 weeks, I ate a proper meal without my stomach, trying to stage a protest halfway through. We talked. Really talked the way we hadn't in 14 weeks. Not the careful professional exchanges, not the stretched, thin, pleasant, but properly openly. The way the Morrison account weeks had almost been, but hadn't quite gotten to, because we'd both been too aware of the line we were approaching and too unwilling to name it. He told me he'd moved back to town because his father had asked him to help with the business, and because he'd been ready to come back, and because… He paused here. Looked at his coffee. Because he'd been lonely in the other city, in the way that you can be lonely in a full life, when none of the fullness is quite the right shape. I told him I understood that kind of loneliness. He asked about the pregnancy, not with the careful, tiptoeing energy I'd been dreading, but with real curiosity, the kind that wants information because it plans to be involved. He asked what the doctor had said about timeline. He asked if I'd had morning sickness. I told him it had been more like all-day sickness for the first month, and he winced in a genuine, sympathetic way, and I thought, he is going to be good at this, if I let him. The letting was the thing. The letting had always been the thing. I am not a person who lets people in easily. My history with it. And I will not go into the whole history here because this is not that story. Is patchy enough that I built walls a long time ago and have been maintaining them with the same energy I give to the Greenfield and Sons books. Careful. Consistent, not letting anything get out of balance. Jeffrey Rollins, over 11 months, had been quietly finding gaps in the walls, not forcing them, just noticing them, sitting on the edge of my desk instead of standing at a professional distance, bringing 2 coffees without being asked. Staying late on the Morrison account not because he had to, but because I understood now he'd wanted to. Sitting in a clinic waiting room without being asked to come in, and then coming in when I asked. The watch, he said, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd cup of coffee. Tell me about it. I told him about my grandfather. The engraving, the 6 years of wearing it, the weight of it on my wrist, and how it had become so habitual that I barely noticed it until it was gone. And how its absence still surprised me sometimes, a small missing weight on the left side. He listened. Then he said very quietly, I'm going to get it back. Jeffrey, you don't have to. The pawn shop will hold it for 30 days, he said. It's been 12. I'm going to get it back. That's $380. I know. You are not paying $380 for my grandfather's watch. I'm not paying for the watch, he said. I'm paying for the ultrasound. The watch just happens to be where the money went. I stared at him. That's the same thing, I said. It really isn't, he said, and he looked at me with that steady gray-eyed patience, the patience of someone who has made up his mind and is simply waiting for you to catch up with him. I thought about arguing. I am good at arguing. I have all the arguments ready about independence and not needing things from people and the importance of handling your own accounts, so to speak. But I was also tired. And the watch had been my grandfather's. And the person across from me was looking at me like I was something he'd decided on, something he'd been patient about for 11 months and then 14 weeks more, and was done being patient about. Okay, I said. 3rd time I'd said that word this morning. It was becoming a habit, a new kind of habit, the unsettling kind that feels like it might actually be good for you. He drove me home. He walked me to the door. We stood on the front step for a moment in the cold, the printout from the ultrasound in my coat pocket. And I thought about the night 14 weeks ago and the morning after and the kitchen silence and how much had changed since then. How much had been accumulating in the space between us without either of us being willing to say so. Can I come in? He said. We don't have to. I'm not ready to go back to, he gestured. A vague gesture that I interpreted correctly as meaning normal. To how it was. How it wasn't working very well, I agreed. No, he said, it wasn't. I unlocked the door. I let him in. We spent the afternoon on my couch. That's all. Nothing dramatic, nothing that needs to be dramatized. We sat on my couch with the printout on the coffee table between us and the heat on and the light going golden thin. As the afternoon got later and we talked and were quiet and talked again, and at some point his hand found mine and stayed there, and at some point I leaned into his side without planning to, and it felt like something settling. Like a number that had been off by a fraction finally aligning with the column it was supposed to be in. He made dinner. He was better in a kitchen than I'd expected. Competent and unfussy, the way he was about most things. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him and thought about the word want. About how I'd become so good at not wanting things, at preemptive not wanting as a form of self-protection, that I'd gotten confused about whether I was not wanting by choice or by reflex. This did not feel like not wanting. This felt uncomfortably and wonderfully like the opposite. November became December, and December was its own kind of negotiation. We didn't announce anything at work. Patricia was perceptive enough that I suspected she noticed the shift, the way things between Jeffrey and me had become easier, warmer, less careful. But she was also the kind of person who waited for people to come to her with things rather than going to get them. And so we had a few more weeks before we had to have that conversation. In those weeks, things were built. Small things mostly. The kind of things that don't look like much from the outside, but that you feel the weight of from the inside. He started coming to the grocery store with me on Saturdays. This was his idea, offered casually one Friday evening when I'd mentioned needing to do a shop, and I'd said yes in the same casual register, and now it was a thing, a simple weekly, domestic thing that I had not expected to find as stabilizing as I did. Walking the aisles with someone. Having someone to hand the list to while you check the produce. Someone whose preferences you were slowly learning. He liked darker bread. He was particular about coffee. He had a secret weakness for the cereal with the marshmallows in it that he tried to hide behind choosing the sensible oat clusters. He went to Mercer Pawn on a Tuesday in early December. He didn't tell me ahead of time. He just came over that evening with the watch in his hand, set it on my kitchen table, and said, "The clasp needed fixing." Dale fixed it. I picked it up. Turned it over. "Keep good time." I put it on. "Thank you," I said. "You're welcome," he said. Simple, unadorned. And then he asked if I'd eaten, and I said not yet, and he opened my fridge and started taking stock of what was in it. We told Patricia on a Thursday. I had written and rewritten what I was going to say several times, because I had prepared remarks for most things in my life. And this seemed like the kind of situation where prepared remarks were appropriate. Jeffrey sat next to me in Patricia's office and let me do the talking, and stepped in once, at the end, when I faltered, just to say, "We're figuring it out together." Patricia looked at us for a long moment. Then she said, "Well, I've been wanting to update the insurance coverage for 2 years. I think this is the push I needed." I blinked. That's it?" I said. "Ray," Patricia said with the gentle patience of a woman who had watched me run her books with paranoid precision for 3 years. "You're the best employee I've ever had, and you're also the most convinced that the world is going to fall on you for taking up space in it. The world is not going to fall on you." She looked at Jeffrey. "Take care of him." "I know," Jeffrey said, not as a promise to do something he hadn't thought of, as a confirmation of something already in progress. Christmas came. We spent it at his father's house, Gerald's house, which was bigger than I'd expected and warmer than I'd expected, and full of the particular chaos of a family that has been celebrating the same holidays together for decades and has developed rituals that can only be explained, not justified. I sat at the dinner table next to Jeffrey and across from Gerald, who had salt and pepper hair and Jeffrey's gray eyes, and who shook my hand when we arrived and said, "He's talked about you since the day he got back. I wondered when you'd both figure it out." Which was embarrassing and also, somehow, extremely nice. I was 13 weeks by then. There was nothing to see yet from the outside, but I was aware of it constantly. A small, continuous presence in the edge of my consciousness. The way you're aware of a light in the next room even when you're not looking at it. After dinner, sitting in the living room while Gerald argued with his brother about something television-related, Jeffrey leaned over and said, very quietly, into my hair, Okay? Yeah, I said. And then, because I was practicing being honest about these things, more than okay. He put his arm around me. His family moved and laughed around us. Outside, it had started to snow. The first real snow of the season, coming down in steady, committed flakes. I thought about the cereal aisle in October, the test in my coat pocket, the smile of the stranger with the toddler. I thought about Dale at the pawn counter, giving me $3.80 when I'd only asked for $3.50. I thought about the heartbeat on the screen, rapid and steady and absolutely committed to being there. I thought about the word want and how I was getting better at letting myself feel it without immediately building a wall around it. January is a long month. It always is. The holiday brightness has left, and the cold has settled in for real, and everything is the color of old paper. January is the month when you find out what things are made of, because there's nothing to distract you from their actual substance. I was 16 weeks. I'd started to show, just slightly, just the beginning of it, a change in the silhouette that I noticed in the mirror each morning with a feeling I was still learning to name. Not dread, which I'd expected. Not quite joy yet, which I was working toward. Something in between, a sort of steady, widening astonishment, like watching something unfold that you'd been told about but never quite believed in. Jeffrey noticed before I said anything. Of course he did. He noticed everything. This was one of the things I was learning about him, that underneath the calm, easygoing exterior was a person of almost absurd attentiveness, who filed things away and remembered them and referenced them weeks later in ways that made you realize you'd been seen much more completely than you thought. One morning in January, he came up behind me while I was making coffee and put his hand on my waist, and I felt it. The way he adjusted slightly unconsciously, accommodating the small change in shape, and I turned around and he looked at me with that steady gray regard. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Better," I said. "The nausea is mostly gone." Not what I meant. I looked at him. He waited. "Scared," I said, still, but a different kind of scared. The kind where you're also, where underneath the scared, there's something else. Something good? Something I don't have a word for yet. He nodded like that was a complete answer, like he could wait for the word. We found a bigger place in February. This was a conversation I'd been circling for weeks. The math of it was obvious. My small house was not suited for 3 people, and he'd been spending most of his nights there anyway. But the math of it was also terrifying in a way that the literal math never is, because it meant something moving in together. It meant committing to the version of things that was currently forming between us, rather than the carefully contained, manageable version I'd been trying to maintain in my head. Jeffrey raised it first. This surprised me. I'd expected to be the one to raise it, since I was the one with the spreadsheet brain, the one who had already quietly run the numbers on every apartment in a reasonable radius. "I found a place," he said, one February evening, sitting on my couch with his laptop open. 2 bedrooms, good light, yard. He turned the laptop so I could see it. It's 9 minutes from the office. I looked at the listing. Good bones. Slightly smaller than what I'd been looking at, but the price was better and the light was, as he'd said, genuinely good. You could tell from the photos the way winter light came through the south-facing windows. "You want to live together," I said. "I want to stop commuting between my apartment and your house," he said, "and I want—" He paused, chose his words. "I want to be there. When things start to feel more real. I don't want to be 9 minutes away." 9 minutes was not far. 9 minutes was nothing practically. But I understood what he meant. I understood the difference between 9 minutes away and there. And I understood that he was not asking me to do anything I hadn't, at some level, already decided I wanted. "Okay," I said. 4th, 5th, 6th time. It was becoming the word I said when something was happening that I had decided to let happen, when I was choosing to trust instead of recoil. I was learning to love the sound of it. We put in an application the next day. Moving was chaotic, the way moving always is. We did it on a Saturday in early March, with help from Jeffrey's cousin Marcus and my friend Leela, who had been told everything by then and who responded to the news by showing up with a casserole and the energy of someone who had been waiting for this development for a long time. "You've been in love with someone for 11 months, and I didn't know," she said, in my kitchen, while we packed dishes. Not accusatory, more like delighted. Like this was the best kind of gossip. "I didn't know either," I said. "Not exactly. Ray." She gave me a look. "You reorganized your entire filing system around his client accounts. I'm your friend," I noticed. I had not known that was obvious. Apparently, it had been obvious. "The filing system is logical," I said with dignity. "It is," she said. "It's also entirely organized around making sure you and Jeffrey Rollins would need to interact about the Morrison account," which I found interesting at the time. I put a plate in a box with perhaps slightly more force than necessary. Leela laughed and handed me the bubble wrap. The new place had a room with good light that we decided was the nursery. We painted it in March, a warm, dusty green that took 3 paint swatches and 2 arguments and 1 very pleasant afternoon of rolling it onto the walls together, music on. The windows opened to the first real warmth of spring. I was 22 weeks. The scan at 20 weeks had been long and thorough and slightly terrifying in its detail. The sonographer moving methodically through a checklist of a developing body, fingers, spine, chambers of a heart, and at the end of it, Jeffrey had asked the question I'd been turning over in my head for weeks. "Do you want to know?" he'd asked before we went in. "We don't have to." "I want to know," I'd said. We knew. Standing in the half-painted nursery in March, I looked at Jeffrey with paint on his forearm and his hair pushed back and the particular ease of a Saturday afternoon on his face. And I thought about how this had started. A pawn shop receipt falling from a coat pocket, a man in a doorway holding it, the decision I'd made when I said, "Sit down, close the door." I thought about all the decisions since then, the small ones and the large ones, and the ones that didn't feel like decisions at the time, but turned out to be the most important. "Hey," Jeffrey said, noticing me noticing him. "You okay?" "More than okay," I said, 3rd time for that one. I was building a small vocabulary of phrases that meant the same thing. I'm in this, I want this, I'm not going anywhere. He came over and kissed me, briefly, tasting faintly of paint smell and coffee, and then looked at the walls and said, "I think it needs a second coat on that left wall." I looked at the left wall. "Agreed," I said. We got back to work. April smelled like something opening. I was 26 weeks and my body was its own ongoing project, the expanding geography of it that I was still mapping new parts of each day. The backache that arrived in earnest at week 24. The way my center of gravity had shifted so that I moved differently now, the small recalibrations of a body accommodating a life inside it. Jeffrey bought a book. Several books, actually. He was approaching impending fatherhood the way he approached the complex client accounts, which was to say with thorough research and a tendency to underline things. He had a notepad that he wrote questions in, questions he brought to my obstetrician appointments with the quiet diligence of someone who had decided this was information he was responsible for having. The obstetrician, Dr. Trician. Haas was a small, efficient woman who had clearly seen every variation of the situation human reproduction produces, and she responded to Jeffrey's questions with the same level, informational calm she brought to everything. The first time he'd come with me, she'd asked if he was the father, and he'd said yes, and she'd nodded, made a note, and moved on. And I'd felt something release in my chest, the anticipated difficulty of the thing not materializing the world, simply acknowledging that this was what it was and moving forward. I was still learning how to accept it when the world did that, when it was simple. In April, I came home from work one evening to find Jeffrey at the kitchen table with a folder of paperwork and the expression of someone who has discovered something and isn't sure how to present it. "What?" I said, putting my bag down. "I was looking into paternity leave," he said, "for myself, through the company." I sat down. And Gerald is willing to extend whatever you need," he said. "Paid for the first 8 weeks. For both of us, he's changing the policy." Gerald Rollins, who had built his landscaping company over 30 years and whose policy handbook had not been updated since before Jeffrey was born. had apparently decided, upon learning that his son was going to be a father, that it was time for a comprehensive update. "Patricia called me this afternoon," I said slowly, "about the insurance. Already switched to the new provider," Jeffrey said, "retroactive to January. So the ultrasound would have been covered," he said, "if we'd had the new plan." I sat with that for a moment. The ultrasound that had cost me my grandfather's watch, the 380 from Dale, the receipt in the coat pocket. "If that hadn't happened," I said, thinking through it, "you wouldn't have found the receipt." "No. And I might have. It might have been longer before I told you." "Probably," he agreed. He was watching me with that careful attention. "So," I said slowly, "the watch being gone was the thing that started it," he said. "Not the original thing, but the thing that made it real," I said. "Made it something that had to be shared," he said. We looked at each other across the kitchen table with the folder of paternity leave paperwork between us, and I thought about all the ways that things connect, the accidental and the inevitable. The small disasters that turn out to be the doors you needed to walk through, the costs that turn out to be not losses, but trade-offs. The exchange of one thing for something else that couldn't be quantified. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "I want to get the watch appraised," I said. "Properly, not at the pawn shop." He raised an eyebrow. "In case we want to pass it on," I said. "Eventually, it should have a proper record." He turned his hand over and held mine. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." And May was busy with preparation. The nursery was finished, properly. Finished the furniture assembled across 2 weekends, with varying degrees of profanity from Jeffrey and calm instructions from me. Because we had, in our division of labor, naturally settled into him doing the physical construction while I read the instructions aloud, which suited us both, and produced one very small bookshelf, one crib, and a chair by the window for late nights. Leela threw a small gathering. She called it a shower in the original sense of the word, she said, meaning showering someone with what they need, which she felt had gotten commercialized but was a good instinct, at her apartment in May, and it was small and genuinely warm, just the people who'd actually been part of the story. And Jeffrey sat next to me the whole time with his shoulder against mine and his hand finding mine occasionally across the armrest, and I watched my friends in the room and thought about the cereal aisle again. The way I had stood there alone with the test and the box of oat clusters and the terror. This was nothing like that. This was the opposite of that. June was the beginning of waiting in earnest. 32 weeks. The appointments were more frequent now. The preparing had largely been done, and what was left was time. The particular suspended quality of the last stretch where you're between states, waiting for the next thing to begin. I worked from home most days by then. Patricia had insisted, not as an accommodation but as a sensible logistical decision, she'd said, and I'd argued briefly and then let it go because I was getting better at letting things go. My desk was by the south-facing window, and I could see the small yard from it. And in the mornings, Jeffrey made coffee and brought it up before he left for the office, and we had 10 minutes together in the early light before the day started. And those 10 minutes were, I won't say perfect because nothing is perfect, and I'm a person who deals in precision, but those 10 minutes were very good. Consistently, reliably good. He called during the day sometimes, not always, not enough to interrupt, but enough that the day had his presence woven through it. He texted at lunch. He came home in the evening and asked about my day with the genuine interest of someone who actually wanted to know, not the performance of it. I was not used to being cared for. I want to be honest about this. Not in a dramatic way, not deprived of it, not starved of it, but simply unaccustomed. I had been independent for a long time, competently, purposefully independent, and independence had become so habitual that being cared for felt foreign, like a language I'd studied but never been fully immersed in. I was getting more fluent. There were still moments when the reflex kicked in, when Jeffrey offered to carry something and I almost said I'm fine before stopping myself. When he noticed I was uncomfortable before I'd mentioned it, and the instinct was to say I hadn't said anything before realizing that was the point. That being known by someone meant sometimes They saw the thing before you, named it. "You're doing it again," he said one evening from across the couch. "Doing what?" "The thing where you go very quiet and your face does the closed thing." "My face doesn't do a closed thing. It absolutely does a closed thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just—" He looked at me steadily. "What's in your head?" I looked at the window. The June evening was blue and long outside it. "I keep thinking about my grandfather," I said. "The watch, the engraving." "Keep good time," Jeffrey said. "He gave it to me when I was 22, he said." I paused. He said it because he thought I needed to slow down. I was always running, always ahead of where I was, always thinking about the next thing. He said, "Ray, just keep good time. Stay where you are." Jeffrey was quiet. "I've been thinking about that a lot," I said. "About what it means to stay where you are. I've always been a little ahead of myself. Planning, preparing, managing things before they need to be managed." I looked down at the watch on my wrist. This year has been the first time I've actually been. I struggled for it. Here, in the right now. Not in what's coming or what might go wrong. "Because of the pregnancy?" "Because of you," I said. "And the pregnancy. Both. But mostly." I stopped. This was the kind of thing I was still learning to say, the words that required opening rather than closing. "Because you kept showing up, even when I was making it difficult. You just kept being there, and eventually it was easier to be here than to be ahead of myself." He reached over and took my hand. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. It was the same thing he'd said in the parking lot outside the clinic 8 months ago. It had the same quality now, not a promise about the future so much as a fact about the present. "This is what is true right now. Keep good time." "I know," I said. "I believe you." "Good," he said, "because I meant it." July was hot and slow, and I was 36 weeks, and the weight of everything, quite literally, was something I was negotiating daily, and Jeffrey had learned the particular vocabulary of the 3rd trimester, which is to say, he brought ice water without being asked, and didn't comment on how many pillows I needed, and had installed a grab bar in the bathroom without announcement, just appeared one morning having done it. "Did you read about that?" I asked. "In the chapter about week 34, he said. "The book recommended it." "You're taking notes," I said, "from a book about how to take care of me." "I'm thorough," he said, without apology. I thought about this later, lying in bed in the July heat with the fan on. The thoroughness of him. The research and the notes and the grab bar and the folder of paternity leave paperwork and the morning coffee and the $380 to Mercer Pawn. The patience of 11 months of being professional and careful, and then the simplicity of sitting in a chair across from my desk and saying, "I'll drive you." I thought about how I had spent so long being good at not needing things, and how strange and how right it was that the thing I'd most needed when I finally let myself see it had been there all along in the most inconvenient and wonderful and completely characteristic way. It was a Saturday at the end of July when things began, 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd been sleeping badly for weeks. This was expected and had been explained to me medically, but was still exhausting. And I was lying in the dark thinking about the Greenfield & Sons quarterly report I needed to finish, which is the kind of thing your brain does to you at 4 in the morning when it has decided that sleep is no longer on the menu. And then it wasn't a thought about the quarterly report anymore. It was something else entirely. Jeffrey was awake before I said anything. This is one of the things about him. He is a light sleeper, and he had become attuned, over the months, to the specific changes in my breathing and movement that meant something was different. By the time I sat up, he was already sitting up next to me, a hand on my back. "Hey," he said. "Hey, okay, I've got you." "It's time," I said. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He was already reaching for his phone, already calm in the way he got when something real needed to happen. Not the absence of feeling, but the marshalling of it, the same way he ran the field crews. The same steady competence that had made me trust him before I'd admitted I trusted him. He called the hospital. He got our bag. He drove to the hospital at 4:30 in the morning, with the streets empty and the streetlights making small yellow islands of light, and he held my hand at every red light. And somewhere between the house and the hospital, I thought, this is the right time, keep good time, stay where you are. I stayed where I was. 11 hours later in the hospital room, in the particular profound exhaustion of having done the most enormous physical thing I had ever done. I held someone very new and very small, and still slightly stunned by the existence of the world. Jeffrey was sitting next to me. His hand was in my hair, gentle and quiet. I looked down. Small face, small hands with their extraordinarily detailed fingers, the solemnity of a new person taking stock of things. "Hey," I said softly to this very small person. "Hey, I'm your dad." I paused. "There are two of us. The other one is here too." Jeffrey leaned in. "Hi," he said. His voice was wrecked, the way a voice gets when you're trying to hold something enormous and not entirely succeeding. "I'm Jeffrey. We've been waiting for you." Outside the window, late July was doing its full summer thing, hot and full of light, the kind of afternoon that feels like it should go on forever. Inside the room it was quiet, except for the small sounds of a new person. I thought about October, the cereal aisle, the test. I thought about February, the first real snow, Gerald's house. He's talked about you since the day he got back. I thought about the watch, the engraving, keep good time. I looked at Jeffrey. He was looking at me. "Okay?" he said, the way he always said it. "More than okay," I said, the way I always said it back. The watch came back from the proper appraiser in September, with a small official document that noted its provenance and value and recommended care. I put the document in the file I'd created for it, a file that also held the 3 pregnancy tests, which I had kept despite everything, and the ultrasound printout from November, slightly worn at the fold now, and a receipt from Mercer Pawn on Mercer Street. I kept the receipt because it was the beginning, not of everything. The beginning was earlier than that, was probably the first day Jeffrey came back and leaned on the edge of my desk and made the kind of small talk that felt in retrospect like reconnaissance, like someone quietly finding out if there was space for them. But the receipt was where the secret became something shared, where the private became the beginning of us. And I am a person who keeps records. The watch was on my wrist. It had been on my wrist every day since Jeffrey put it back there in December, and it would be for a long time. Eventually, in the years from now version of this story that I could sometimes see when I was feeling particularly okay about things, I thought it might be on someone else's wrist. A wrist much smaller than mine for a long time before it grew into it. But that was ahead of us. That was in the future. Right now was September, and a small, very opinionated person was asleep in the nursery we had painted the dusty green that took 2 arguments and 1 very pleasant afternoon. And Jeffrey was in the kitchen making the kind of methodical, documented coffee that I had learned to find deeply comforting. And I was at my desk by the window with the quarterly report open and the file beside me and the watch on my wrist and the particular hard-won knowledge that this, all of this, the numbers and the people and the warm September light through the glass was where I was supposed to be. Here, not ahead of it, not around it or beside it or at a careful professional distance from it. Here, in it, all the way. Keep good time. I was keeping it. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.